my dears, and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I'm so glad to have you as always. I hope that you're doing well. My name is Sydney. I'm an actor, dramaturg, and educator with a specific research focus in accessible education, minority media analysis, and accessible theater. I'm also a white young person with light brown, just beyond shoulder length curly hair that has a cream colored bow in it, and I'm wearing a pink dress with fluffy sleeves that has little bows on it. And if you're new here, hi, this is the series where we break down shows that involve disability, some in more obvious ways than others, to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be. We work on those critical thinking, media analysis skills, maybe unpack a little bit of some ableist ideas we didn't realize we'd internalized, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and or talk about these shows if that's even possible, which sometimes it isn't. Always with a cool that happened, now what mindset that lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. If you're interested in more TV and film and book disability analyses, I make 2 of those a week as short form content that you can find on here, also my Instagram and TikTok. Theater gets the deep dives because that's my primary job and also my degree. But either way, if you want to learn more about disability in media and or disability theater things, I have many a link for you at the top of my description, followed by as many of the sources as I could cram into the description because there's a lot of academic discussion about this show. Also, while you're down there, you can find the like and subscribe buttons as well as the comment section, which you're welcome to add to, and the link to my Patreon if you want to support me and get early access to what I'm up to, but also absolutely no pressure. That was all the things. Now before we dive in, and this is going to be a long one in case you can't already tell, my apologies, it won't be as long as Sweeney though. I don't think I will ever again in my life have even the brain capacity to talk about a show for 2.5 hours, and it's still one of my proudest and scariest achievements. But focusing on the topic at hand, before we dive in, I want to briefly bring up 2 things about the show. The first is that because Laura in The Glass Menagerie is one of, if not the most famous portrayals of disability in theater, you could also kind of argue it is one of the, if not the first primary portrayals of disability in theater. I could argue either way. Disabled people have a lot of opinions on this play, some of which have been made based solely on reading the play in English class, some of which have been based on seeing it, some of which have been made solely because when it's brought up in disabled spaces, a lot of people groan and roll their eyes, so you just kind of get a vibe. And also, disability aside, the show is such a big part of both theater history and general culture that everybody kind of has opinions on it. But I bring this up because, as we learned from Tommy, which has a very similar cultural situation, this is going to get a lot more complicated and messy and nuanced than us who like to make firm, solid opinions on things will like it to be. I know that I went into this with an inherent bias based on the fact that the majority of my disabled friends refuse to, under any and all circumstances, do this play. And so I encourage you to clock whatever bias you may have right now, and I'm not going to say leave it at the door because that's not how people work, but just like be aware that bias is a thing and be willing to throw it out the window if need be down the line, or not if need be. Let's see how this goes. The second thing that I'm going to say that doesn't really matter but also does for representation purposes is that this is the precise kind of play that I would have read in an English class and I would have sat there feeling like I was not smart or capable of understanding media or of doing theater and therefore did not deserve to, and I would have written this play off right away as something that I hated. Because Menagerie is one of those plays where there's so much coding and metaphor and subtext baked into it that I would always miss as an autistic reader and felt like I was like on a completely different planet or reading a completely different text from everybody else around me in a classroom setting. And I'm obviously a great deal better at spotting these things now, because I've been doing this as a job for a while, but on my first read I still felt a little bit of that like 10th grade English insecurity and anxiety in my chest, and it took me a couple reads through the script to really feel like I got it and I understood it. And I still might miss some metaphor or another in this play, but that doesn't mean that I don't get the play or that I'm not worthy of reading it or that my opinions on it and discussions around it don't still matter. In fact, somebody who looks at a piece of media differently and finds a different metaphor or a different meaning from something is incredibly crucial and valuable to literary discussion, and I just want that to be stated out loud, particularly for this piece which is often academically analyzed to death. Don't let the fact that you don't quite get something on the first try be the reason that you feel like you're not allowed to get it at all, or that it's not for you, or like you're never going to be able to understand it, or that the meaning that you do get from it is less valuable than the prescribed meaning that comes up on SparkNotes. Learning lots of ways to look at things and learning to be able to spot those things is important, but that does not mean that the way that you're looking at it is inherently wrong. And thus ends my necessary speech to a younger me. Let's talk about The Glass Menagerie. This is a play here. Let me show it to you. This is a play that's written by Tennessee Williams that was his first commercially successful play and premiered in 1944 in Chicago, then moving to Broadway in 1945. If you care about theaters, which I do, the theater that this show is originally in was the Playhouse, which was then torn down to become part of the Rockefeller Center Avenue of the Americas situation. It ran there for just over a year, and then it moved to the Royale Theater, which is now the Bernard B. Jacobs, for another month and a half before it closed. It did not win any Tony Awards, but that's because the Tony Awards became a thing a year after it closed. But it did win the New York Drama Critics Circle Award for Best American Play, and it has since had 6 revivals on Broadway and at least 1 off-Broadway revival that I know of, and it is done regionally literally all the time. It's done in every single college forever, and it's been on the West End also a bunch of times, but I didn't quite keep track of that because I used the Broadway archives. There's also so many film, TV, radio play adaptations to choose from. I watched 4 productions, 2 films, 2 TV films, and listened to 3 radio play versions. We're gonna break all those down in a little bit. Also, I talked to a lot of former Lauras. We're gonna get to that as well. All of which to say, this play is very well loved and very much talked about and produced a lot. And that does not even count the sheer amount of people who read this in high school or college literature classes or had to do one of these monologues in their acting program, because that seems to be a very large portion of the population. This play is also considered the piece of Williams' work that is the most autobiographical. Also, if you're new to Tennessee as a dude, he's considered to be one of the most important playwrights of the early 20th century American theater, along with Eugene O'Neill and Arthur Miller. Some of his other plays you may have heard of are Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and A Streetcar Named Desire. His actual first name is Thomas, and he grew up in Mississippi and later in St. Louis in a house with a violent alcoholic father who was often away and a sometimes obsessive mother. He also had a younger sister named Rose, who was a little odd and at age 18 was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she spent many years in and out of institutions and hospitals until January of 1943, when she, at the authorization of their mother, had one of the first bilateral prefrontal lobotomies and was institutionalized for the rest of her life. Tennessee was very upset by this, and as soon as he had the money, he moved her to a private institution and visited her often, giving her a percentage of interest in several of his plays. He greatly feared going mad like she did and struggled for much of his life with addiction and depression, which ultimately killed him at age 71. It's also important to note that he was a gay man in a time when that was very much not talked about and not okay, which reflects in a lot of his themes in his plays around repression, suppression, and conformity. The Glass Menagerie has 4 characters: the mom, Amanda Wingfield, Tom, our narrator, Laura, the sister, and the disabled character that we're going to be discussing today, and Jim, the gentleman caller who appears in Act 2. And there's also a portrait of the father on the wall. He left them a while ago, and again, these characters are very directly based off of his mother, himself, and his sister Rose. I'm just going to read you their character descriptions rather than try to describe them, not using the exact words from the text, and then we will go through the plot. Amanda Wingfield, the mother, a little woman of great but confused vitality, clinging frantically to another time and place. Her characterization must be carefully created, not copied from type. She's not paranoiac, but her life is paranoia. There's much to admire in Amanda, and as much to love and pity as there is to laugh at. Certainly she has endurance and a kind of heroism, and though her foolishness makes her unwittingly cruel at times, there is tenderness in her slight person. Laura Wingfield, her daughter, Amanda, having failed to establish contact with reality, continues to live vitally in her illusions, but Laura's situation is even graver. A childhood illness has left her crippled, one leg slightly shorter than the other and held in a brace. This defect need not be more than suggested on the stage. Stemming from this, Laura's separation increases till she is like a piece of her own glass collection, too exquisitely fragile to move from the shelf. It's also suggested in the lighting section that the light upon Laura should be distinct from the others, having a peculiar pristine clarity such as light used in early religious portraits of female saints or Madonnas. Tom Wingfield, her son, and the narrator of the play, a poet with a job in a warehouse. His nature is not remorseless, but to escape from a trap he has to act without pity. Jim O'Connor, the gentleman caller, a nice, ordinary young man. The other thing is that this play is where the term memory play comes from, because Tom literally says in his opening monologue that this is a memory play. We'll get to that. Also, just to set it up properly, I do need you to know that Tennessee has over 2 full pages of stage directions, plus 2 full pages of production notes before the first line is even uttered. He was a precise dude, I kind of respect it. Now, the show begins with Tom dressed as a merchant sailor telling the audience about how he's going to give us truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion. He then tells us about how we're in St. Louis, in the era where the middle class of America is starting to become upsettingly aware of the fact that the economy is dissolving and scrambling to do something about this in a typically an unhelpful, flailingly chaotic manner. This is told through a disability metaphor. I completely forgot about that until writing this summary portion, so I'm just not going to include it in my analysis at all, but please know that the play effectively does begin with a disability metaphor, and that does give us a strong impression as to what the rest of the play is going to look like around disability specifically. He says this play is a memory play, which means that it is dimly lighted, it is sentimental, it is not realistic. He says that he is the narrator and also a character in the play along with these other characters, and then the lights come up on Laura Laura, Amanda, and Tom at the dinner table, where Amanda is going on and on about church and then starts pestering Tom about how he isn't chewing properly and how that's an issue, and then finally he snaps back at her and then he walks out of the room. Laura stands up at the same time and offers to go get coffee, and Amanda tells her to sit down and look pretty for all of her gentlemen callers who are going to be coming. And she's like, I'm not expecting any gentlemen callers, and Amanda's like, well, you never know. Back when I was a girl, and Tom starts to complain, and Laura tells him to just let her tell the story because she loves to tell it. And so Amanda goes on and on about how she once had 17 gentlemen callers in one afternoon, and she tells stories about her favorites of these callers, finally landing on the badly disguised disappointment that she ended up with their father instead, which she copes with by asking Laura how many callers she expects to get this evening, and she's like, I don't think we're going to receive any, Mother. And her mother's like, why? Has there been like some horrible storm to prevent them being able to show up? And she's like, no. I'm just not popular like you were. And then she says, Mother's afraid that I'm going to be an old maid. Scene 2 opens on Laura sitting and polishing her collection of glass animals that makes up her menagerie, hears her mother coming, and then runs to the typewriter and starts typing on it frantically. Amanda enters looking distraught, and Nora nervously asks how the DAR meeting went, and Amanda says she simply couldn't go to the meeting because she wanted to crawl into a hole and die. She has a bit of a flair for the dramatic, in case you can't tell, especially when she wants to guilt her kids into doing something. Anywho, she says that on the way to the DAR meeting, she decided to stop by the business college that Laura's been attending for typing classes for the last 6 weeks to let them know that Laura has had a cold for a bit, which is why she's been absent, and to also inquire about Laura's progress at this typing school. And the instructor is like, I don't know who Laura is, and then ends up showing the mom the attendance book that shows that Laura dropped out after a few days when she got physically ill during a speed typing test. And Amanda is so upset by this news that she comes straight home. She gives Laura a lecture about how giving up the business college means giving up any hopes for a future for her, asks what she's been doing all day, and Laura mentions that she's been going out walking every day. She visits all these kinds of places like the art museum and the zoo and the greenhouses to look at flowers, which her mother completely diminishes, and then starts asking her what her plan is to do for the rest of her life, because that was her only hope, and now what is there left but for them to be dependent for the rest of their lives. And she goes on a whole rant about that until she remembers that some girls marry, and so then she asks Laura if she's ever liked a boy, and Laura's like, yes, one boy in high school whose name was Jim, and he called me Blue Roses after mishearing me say that I had been out sick with pleurosis, but he got engaged to another girl and they're probably married by now. And Amanda's like, oh, it's fine, it doesn't matter. Little girls who aren't cut out for business careers sometimes end up married to very nice young men, and I'm just gonna see that you do that too. And Laura goes, but Mother, I'm crippled. I forgot to mention that that's technically a slur now, so don't use it in case you weren't aware. But anyway, after she says that, Amanda gets very angry and says, don't use that word, you're not crippled, you just have a slight defect, a slight disadvantage, and you just need to cultivate something else to take its place, like vivacity or charm. Then it's scene 3, which Tom opens in the alleyway outside of the apartment, saying that finding a gentleman caller for Laura has become a sort of obsession for Amanda, which included getting a job roping in subscribers to a ladies magazine over the phone in order to get more money and to be able to buy things to make Laura more attractive to a potential suitor. So we see her do one of those calls unsuccessfully and then start to complain about the call, to which Laura's like, Mom, Tom's trying to write. So Mom goes straight over to Tom and turns on the lamp and starts telling him about how he needs to fix his posture and how if he doesn't do that he's going to mess with his internal organs, and he gets really frustrated with her, and then they argue while Laura listens on. And this argument kind of goes like this. Mom, can you leave me alone? Son, you're not yourself lately. What's going on? What's happening to you? Mom, I cannot have a single thing that is my own or a single moment to myself. Yesterday you took the books that I got from the library and you got rid of them. I couldn't have that filth in my house, so I took them back to the library. Your house? Who pays the rent here? How dare you speak to me that way? And then she starts on about the fact that he goes out to the movies every single night, and then he's out so late and she thinks that he's not actually at the movies and he's instead doing behavior that he's ashamed of, which jeopardizes his place at the warehouse, and how dare he be so selfish. And he yells back at her, and then he says that he's going to go off to the movies, and she's like, I don't believe you. And he's like, fine, I'm going to opium dens, I've become a hired assassin, and also you're an actual witch. And then tries to storm out in a way that accidentally causes Laura's shelf of glass to fall, and she cries out, and then he turns around and seems to feel really bad. And Amanda says, I'll never speak to you again unless you apologize, and stomps out, and then he gets on the floor and tries to pick up the pieces of the fallen menagerie. Now it's scene 4. It's late in the evening or very early in the morning, unclear. Tom stumbles home. Laura wakes up. She lets him in. He talks about the movies and then the magic show where he was given a magic scarf that he then gives to Laura. He also mentions that the magician did a trick where he was nailed into a coffin and was able to climb out without removing a single nail. And there's some dialogue about how easy it is to find yourself in that coffin, but how near impossible it is to get out of it. And this scene is particularly important because we really see the amount of love and care between the siblings that is reflected in other scenes, but most explicit here. This then quickly transitions into scene 5, where Amanda is waking them up for the day and refuses to talk to Tom, and Laura implores him to just apologize to her, and Amanda sends Laura out of the store to pick up some butter, and Laura comments about how embarrassing it is to buy things on credit, but then goes out anyway. She falls down the stairs of the fire escape, and everybody runs to make sure she's okay, and then she heads off in search of butter. At this point, Tom apologizes to Amanda for what he said, and she does the whole, well, I try so hard, but really, I'm just a terrible mom. And he kind of placates her, and then she makes him promise that he'll never become a drunkard. And she also tells him that his choice of having just coffee for breakfast is really bad and he needs to eat something solid, and he continuously refuses it, eventually pushing the conversation in a different direction to ask her what she wanted to say about Laura. And she tells him that Laura is sad because she's convinced that Tom isn't happy there, and Amanda agrees that that might be true, somewhat accusing him of being up late to avoid the apartment, and again, doesn't believe he's actually out at the movies. And he says that he genuinely is. He likes that they let him go on adventures in a way that he doesn't get to experience in his day-to-day life. And eventually she says that she saw the letter he received from the Merchant Marine and knows that he's planning to leave, and can he at least make sure that his sister is settled before he leaves, because she simply cannot take care of herself, and any attempt to make that possible, like the business college and bringing her to the Young People's League at church, has been a dismal failure, which then ends up in her basically begging him to invite over a gentleman caller for Laura, which he reluctantly agrees to. The scene ends with Amanda on another phone call trying to sell a magazine subscription. In the final scene of Act 1, Tom is out smoking on the fire escape, and he talks about how they live next door to the Paradise Dance Hall and how he can see people having fun at the dance hall from their apartment. And Amanda comes to meet him out there, and they talk about the moon, and then he tells her that he's invited a gentleman caller by the name of Jim O'Connor over the next night. And she's like, oh, how dare you give me zero time to plan, and starts fussing about it all and asking him far too many questions that he knows zero of the answers to. And at one point in the conversation, he says that he didn't tell Jim that he had a sister, so it doesn't seem like there were ulterior motives to his coming to dinner. And Amanda's like, oh, that's fine, she'll just be so beautiful. And Tom lovingly reminds her not to expect too much from Laura, because while they might not notice that she's crippled anymore because she's theirs and they love her, to which Amanda again refuses to hear that word said out loud, they need to acknowledge that she is quite peculiar and lives in a world of her own. And halfway through this conversation, Amanda cuts it off abruptly by calling for Laura and telling her to come make a wish on the moon, and that is the end of Act 1. Act 2 begins with Tom telling us about Jim, a guy he sorta knew in high school who was a very popular and highly successful kid, but now holds a boring job at the warehouse alongside him. Jim calls Tom Shakespeare, since he knows that Tom will often hide somewhere whenever business is slack and work on writing poems, and the people at the warehouse generally didn't like Tom very much until Jim kind of adopted him of sorts, and so everybody else just kind of became less hostile towards him. Tom also remembers that Laura had thought that Jim's singing voice was very nice when they were in high school together, but wasn't quite sure if he remembered her at all. We then see Amanda and Laura in the living room, with Laura in a fancy dress and Amanda trying to shove powder puffs into her bra to make her less flat-chested, which Laura promptly takes out as Amanda goes off to get changed into her fancy dress, which is one that she wore as a young woman living in the South and is sort of girlish and gaudy. It feels very out of place. But anyway, she goes in a long monologue about jonquils and being a beautiful debutante, and then they hear thunder, and she remarks that she hopes that Tom and Mr. O'Connor will get here before the rain starts, and Laura starts to panic because she's like, Mr. O'Connor? Like my Jim O'Connor? The one that I told you about as being the boy that I really liked when I was in high school? And so she then refuses to go to the table, and she refuses to interact with him altogether because she's going to be sick. But her mother refuses to let this happen. She forces her to open the door to welcome the men, and they have a small awkward conversation, and then Laura kind of books it off stage. And Jim asks Tom what's the matter, and Tom says that she's just terribly shy. Jim and Tom hang out, and Jim tells him about the public speaking classes he's taking and how that's going to make him able to get better jobs than the warehouse, and he suggests that Tom should take them too, and then tells him that the boss doesn't quite like Tom, and also if he doesn't get himself sorted soon, he's definitely going to be out of a job. To which Tom says he hates it there anyway. He's actually joined the Union of Merchant Seamen, and he paid his union dues that month rather than paying the electric bill, and he's going to be leaving them very soon. But also not to say anything about that to his mother because she doesn't know about his plans yet. Amanda comes in and invites them in and really gives Jim some classic Southern hospitality, and also kind of talks his ear off about the weather and the death of Southern gentility and how lovely Laura is. And then they all go to the table for supper, eventually forcing Laura to come to the table, and then she faints in Tom's arms, who then helps her to the sofa to lie down. While Amanda is frantically covering for Laura, being like, oh, she must be ill because of standing over the hot stove, and acting like this has never happened before. And then Tom says grace. In the next scene, we see them at the end of their dinner together and giving a toast to the old south, and then suddenly the lights go out and Amanda realizes that Tom did not pay the electrical bill, and Jim tries to awkwardly make light of the situation and then offers to help with the dishes or something, and she says, oh, it's all right, and sends him off with a lit candelabra to spend some time with Laura while she and Tom clean up. Over the course of her interaction with Jim, Laura starts to slowly come out of her shell little by little. He's very kind with her, albeit maybe a little patronizing or condescending, giving her compliments and asking her questions about what she thinks and what she wants in a way that she's clearly never been interacted with before. He realizes that she is his Blue Roses, who he had chorus class with in high school, and how she always arrived late, and she says it's because of the leg brace that she wore at the time, which made it take longer for her to get upstairs to class, and also clumped horribly loudly, and how embarrassing it was to clump to her seat with everybody watching her every day. And he effectively tells her that he never noticed any clumping, and she shouldn't have let that get in the way of her making friends, and how really everybody's too caught up in their own stuff to pay too much attention to everybody else's stuff. And they talk briefly about her glass menagerie, but he quickly changes the subject to tell her that he's been told that he's really good at analyzing people's psychology, and he thinks that her issue is an inferiority complex and how she needs to learn to gain more confidence in herself as a person. You say that you dreaded to go upstairs. You see what you did? You dropped out of school. You gave up an education all because of a little clump, which as far as I can see is practically non-existent. Oh, a little physical defect is all you have. It's hardly noticeable even, magnified thousands of times by your imagination. You know what my strong advice to you is? You got to think of yourself as superior in some way. Also, that quote and other quotes from this are going to be slightly different based on edition. For some reason, there's some changes between different editions, but I'm quoting from the Dramatist Play Service version. Forgot to mention that earlier, sorry. Anyway, after giving her this speech, he talks about how everybody needs to find the thing that they excel in. For example, he's going to night school because he wants to work in television, so what's her thing? What interests her? And she says that her glass collection is what interests her, which she shows to him and lets him touch, and he listens to her talk so lovingly and caringly about it, particularly the unicorn, which is her favorite piece. And Jim says, aren't unicorns extinct in the modern world? It must be kind of lonesome for him. And she's like, no, he's got the company of all the other horses that don't have horns on the shelf, and so they seem to be content together. And she puts the unicorn on the table, and then Jim walks over to the fire escape and listens to the music outside and asks where it's coming from, and she says the dance hall, so he offers to dance with her, and she's like, oh, I can't dance, I've never danced before, but he manages to convince her into it, and they dance together and they have a lovely time, and she starts giggling until they accidentally bump the table and the unicorn falls, breaking off its horn. He feels really terrible and he starts to apologize, but she doesn't seem to majorly react, and instead is like, oh, it's alright, it could be a blessing in disguise because now he's like all the other horses, and I can pretend that he had an operation or something to make him less freakish. And it's alright because glass breaks so easily, and even the traffic sometimes makes the pieces fall and break. And then they talk a bit more, and he tells her how she's different from everybody else he knows in a good way, how she's special and unique like a blue rose, and how somebody ought to help her become more confident in herself. In fact, somebody ought to kiss her. And then he does. And depending on the edition, sometimes it's just a little kiss and sometimes they fully make out. It depends. But then at the end of that, he freezes and immediately apologizes and tells her that he's going steady with another girl and he really shouldn't have kissed her and he won't call again and he's sorry that he hurt her feelings, and she gives him the broken unicorn as a souvenir. Then Amanda barges in and talks about how she wants him to come visit all the time and was so glad to have him over, and he apologizes and tells her that he's going to be married the second Sunday in June and he has to leave to go pick up his girl at the station. After he leaves, Amanda takes Tom to task for not knowing that Jim was engaged, and he starts to head out and she asks him where he's going and he says to the movies, and she starts to yell at him about how he's gone and made a fool of themselves by not knowing that this man was engaged and inviting him over, and now he's deserting them by going off to the movies and leaving her and his unmarried sister who's crippled. This is the only time that she's willing to say this word, to be selfish and only care about himself. And so he leaves and slams the door, and we see Amanda giving some sort of comforting speech to Laura, who's hiding behind her hair, until at the end of it she lifts her head to smile at her mother. Tom puts on the maritime uniform from the opening soliloquy and begins a closing one. He tells the audience how he left St. Louis and travels around, always feeling pursued by something, and at one point realizes that he's being pursued by Laura, who he tried to leave behind but finds himself more faithful to her than he wants. I reach for a cigarette, I cross the street, I run into a movie or a bar. I buy a drink, I speak to the nearest stranger, anything that can blow your candles out. For nowadays the world is lit by lightning. Blow out your candles, Laura. And then we see her blow out the candelabra candles, and he says, and so, goodbye. And thus ends our play. Now, according to SparkNotes, the themes are of memory, illusion, the complexity of familiar relationships. I would also argue that there are heavy themes of claustrophobia, repression, conformity, and the specific socioeconomic hellscape that was the time between the Great Depression and the Second World War. There is a reason that a lot of the art from this era centers around the idea of conformity and the human machine. This particular play was based on a short story that Tennessee Williams wrote just a few months after Rose's lobotomy, titled Portrait of a Girl in Glass, and apparently is also halfway based on a screenplay screenplay he wrote at some point called The Gentleman Caller, but I couldn't find any further information on that or any traces of it. But anywho, I really love the short story. I highly recommend looking it up if you are bored. It's narrated by Tom, but Laura is really centered, and it feels less coded and less like it's trying to tell you a secret message and sort of hide the true emotions the author has about the source material. You can really tell that he started writing this right after he learned about Rose's lobotomy and is mourning who his sister was. And it also focuses more on her mental disability, mostly because it doesn't include a limp like the play does, so it's not dealing with two things at once. And it seems to be a bit more understanding of how she feels, but also acknowledging that this is actively impeding her ability to live the life that she wants to live and how hard that is. And I would still give it many of the critiques we're going to talk about later in this video, but overall, this story, in my opinion, which is fairly close in plot to the final play, albeit focused only on one portion of it, is actually my preferred version. There's something that just feels warmer and less like he's deliberately trying to create narrative distance between himself and the story. Like, Laura in the play feels like somebody portraying a version of Rose, and the Laura in Portrait of a Girl in Glass just feels like we're seeing a memory of Rose in real time, and I personally quite like that. But anyway, let's play Adaptation Bingo, everybody's favorite game. There are other adaptations that exist between the versions I'm going to tell you about. This list is based primarily on what I could track down. The first is the 1950 film, which was made 5 years after the show opened on Broadway. This was, of course, made during the Hays Code era, where all films were subject to strict censorship laws that often ended up making most adaptations feel like the source material has gone through a blender. This one came out somewhat unscathed. Not entirely. Like, most of the Act 1 scenes are completely out of order. They also utilize the fact that it's a film to have more freedom to show things, like Laura going into the shop to buy the unicorn. We see her at the zoo. We see her getting sick during the typing test. There's also some added dialogue to flesh out specific events and relationships. I was also interested in how Laura as a character doesn't feel as unidimensional and fragile in this version in comparison to how exquisitely fragile she feels to the more modern audience, because limp aside, this is how most pretty young women characters in films of this era were written. So it feels pretty, like, at the same baseline of everything else that would have come out at the time. And the film ends after Tom is gone, with us seeing Laura preparing for another gentleman caller who is coming around after her, and she's excited to see him. Which some may argue is a happy ending that's put in there because not having a sort of happily ever after was not required by the Hays Code, but it was generally implied that morals were to be encouraged, so films were forced to include them to make the censors and wider audiences happy. The screenplay was written by Tennessee Williams himself, so I'm inclined to believe that many of these changes are things he would have added to the play if he had the ability to, but wanted to preserve that specific aesthetic and felt like he had more freedom when adapting it to the screen. But at the same time, I'm also inclined to believe that some of the changes made here maybe weren't things he wanted to happen, but were forced to make them anyway, particularly the happy ending. Tennessee was not really a happy ending kind of dude. Next, we have the 1951 radio play by the Theatre Guild on the Air, starring Helen Hayes as Amanda and Montgomery Clift as Tom. Radio play versions of the show tend to have some small script changes made that primarily turn some of the stage directions and character descriptions into lines, particularly in Tom's soliloquy, so that a listener can imagine what is going on. It also usually cuts the typical hour 45 length to about 50 minutes. 50, not 15. There were two lines in regards to Laura that I did want to note. The first is Tom saying, "Her fragile appearance acquired an almost unearthly prettiness. She seemed like a piece of translucent glass touched by light, given a momentary radiance, not actual, not lasting," which furthers this parallel of Laura as glass. And then when Jim offers to try to fix the unicorn near the end, she says, "No, it doesn't want its horn, it wants to be like the others. It doesn't want to be different," which is a very specific interpretation of what's going on with the unicorn metaphor. I felt like some of the things they expanded upon in the script were expanding upon a very specific direction and opinion for each character that I feel is deliberately more left up to interpretation in the original. That being said, this is my favorite adaptation thus far. It's also free on the internet somewhere. I'll try to link it in the description if I remember. But there's something about this like old-timey audio that makes it feel like a fireside chat and really fits the nostalgia that this piece holds very well. And it also has a live audience. It is the only one of the radio plays I listen to that does have a live audience, and there's just something about hearing other people react to a piece that makes it feel more insular and human and connected and theatrical than the other versions. And also hearing people from the 1950s laugh in the same way that we do today at the same stuff we would find funny today just kind of makes my heart feel nice in a way that I can't quite explain. So if you have a sudden desire to hear this play after this, that would be my recommendation, even if it's not necessarily super strictly to the original script, because the vibes are just immaculate. Next is the 1964 LP version, which I didn't take a lot of notes on because the audio was so deeply crackly that I had to turn it off somewhere in the middle because it was, for sensory reasons, a very difficult lesson. But I did note that this Laura in this version is quite strong in comparison to the weaker sounding, less sure of herself Amanda, which is a very interesting dynamic. 1965 then marks the first Broadway revival of this play, which is at the Brooks Atkinson Theater, which is now the Lena Horne, where Six is playing. That's all the information that I have on it, just stating that it existed. In 1966, we got a TV film, which is very crisply in line with the text. This version is in color. I didn't like that. This version also made it very clear how heavy this play can get without a live audience. Like the 1951 version had all of the harsh pieces that would come with this play, but it just felt lighter, which to me made it easier to listen to and internalize and process the messages of in comparison to this fairly harsh, consistently tense version all the way through. They also used a lot of close-ups because, hey, it's film, why not? But also not a fan of that in this particular setting. And I felt like the fourth wall breaking directly to the camera was done a little wonkily. I kind of prefer the voiceover version from the 1950 film instead. I couldn't tell if they deliberately cast all the characters to be on the much older, clearly adult side, or if this is just the bit of time where we associate this makeup and styling with our parents and grandparents, so we see young people dressed and styled these ways as older than their actual ages. Really unclear to me, but I do think that having them all be older made the story a lot more heartbreaking. Like, a boy in his early 20s wanting to leave his childhood home is expected. A 40-year-old man wanting to leave his childhood home is tragic. But as much as I just complained about this film, I didn't hate it. It just made some interesting choices that maybe weren't my favorite. The 1973 film version has Katharine Hepburn as Amanda and the guy who played Nick Carraway in the 1974 Gatsby as Tom, which I didn't realize until after I wrote in my notes, this Tom has serious Nick Carraway energy. He feels more like a slightly spiteful, lashing out young person in his mid-20s trying to escape, which makes you kind of question, why do we live in a society where he's forced to be the man of the household right now because he is a child, which I kind of loved this angle as well. Amanda is a lot more southern than in the other versions, which when nobody else really majorly had an accent, which I quite liked, it makes her feel even more detached from reality because everybody isn't speaking in the same way that she is. This is also the first time that Amanda's response to the "but mother, I'm crippled" line has been complete, just straight anger. Normally it's a nervous like, "Oh, hush now, don't you let the neighbors know, we won't allow that language in this house." But here it was like she had poked a bear. There was also a sibling bond between Laura and Tom that was very, very strong to a degree that I hadn't really seen in other versions. And the breaking the fourth wall is still a little weird, but it felt more artistic than the like, this is a newscaster we're following energy that the other film had. And it also kind of had ghosts of Laura following him around, and he would turn around and she'd be gone, which is a really nice touch. This was also my favorite of the Jims. He's a bit reserved himself and trying to get out of his shell with the public speaking classes, and so the two of them kind of forced each other out of their comfort zones rather than like the extrovert forcing the introvert to be an extrovert. It made his overstepping of boundaries feel more well-meaning than patronizing. 1975 was the second Broadway revival. This one was at the Circle in the Square, and 1983 was the third Broadway revival of the Eugene O'Neill Theater. Next we have the 1987 film. This one has Joanne Woodward as Amanda. Also, I'm just giving like touchstone famous actors that I know the names of that pop out to me in versions to help differentiate them in my brain. I'm not saying that any specific actor is better or more important than any others. This is just how I remember each version. Anyway, this version breaks the fourth wall in a more friendly, approachable way where it feels like we're following Tom's sort of documentary style and he's aware of us. Much of his commentary is made by him standing in the abandoned apartment in which they all lived during the memory portion, which is interesting because it sort of implies that he left and then they left and then he came back and they were gone. Like, where did they go? Also, this Laura feels the most autistic coded of the film bunch, and this Jim felt kind of sleazy. I was not a fan of him. Amanda was still very southern, which again, I love, and her response to the crippled line was more like, "Oh child, you're just not dreaming big enough for yourself. Oh, stop that. Don't let a label define you." And that's the extent of my notes for this one. I think I really started to lose it around this point. There is only so much glass menagerie a human is meant to consume in a short period of time before their brain just turns to goo and falls out their ears. The fourth Broadway revival was in 1994 at Criterion Stage Right, which was also known as the Olympia for a while. It was in the building where the giant Times Square Toys R Us was, but obviously that's gone now. This is the first stage production that is available at the Theater on Film and Tape Archive at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. We love supporting our local libraries. Now, due to scheduling issues, this was actually the last production of the three on file that I ended up watching, but more generally, seeing the plays felt like watching a whole new menagerie. Live theater is such a different situation than film, and it lends itself more to things being slightly unrealistic, realistic and dissociated and dreamlike and whatnot, and also because with a live audience, the material just ends up feeling lighter, kind of like with the 1951 radio play, as we talked about earlier, because some of the pieces of the script are witty and funny, and getting to laugh at those pieces makes the heavier moments a lot more impactful. Also, the intimacy of theater really adds to this claustrophobic messaging of the play itself, because you feel like you are stuck in the household along with the rest of them. And it's great. This particular production, starring Julie Harris and Kevin Kilner, took the claustrophobia ideas of the play and turned that into literal prison imagery. So the apartment had like gray cement walls, all the costumes were in blacks and grays. The overall set just felt very like a prison cell, which is an intriguing choice, but also for me felt like that choice kind of sucked some of the life and realisticness out of the show, which I'm not opposed to thematically. It just made it feel a lot more boring to me. But also, somebody watching the show 10 times in a row day after day is not maybe the primary target audience, so it might have been perfect for everybody else. Also, there was typewriter text that was projected on the wall above them and some images at some moments, sometimes repeating lines they said in the show or a stage direction or something else that I'm not sure where that came from. Whoever filmed this version clearly did not think that imagery was important, and so I only saw it maybe 4 times for like a couple seconds at a time, but it seems like it was consistent throughout the piece. I can't comment on it. This Laura was interesting because she had a lot of autistic physicality, like dyspraxic physicality, though given the time period that the show was produced, it was definitely meant to be more childlike physicality. This Laura did not have a lot going on behind the eyes and felt developmentally or intellectually disabled to some degree, which I don't think was super deliberate, but was what I got out of it. There was also a moment where Amanda gave Laura medicine, so she's clearly meant to still be sickly and sheltered at a level that I haven't seen in other versions. And with Jim, she felt kind of trapped in her own words, but as soon as he recognized her, it became an excited, giddy word vomit, like the difference between small talk and asking somebody about their special interest, which I quite liked. Also, this Jim made it clear to Laura and Tom that he understands Amanda's kind of crazy and he's sorry that this is their situation, especially at the end when he seemed to regard Laura as like a puppy he's sad to leave at the shelter rather than a human person he wants more connection with but can't due to the situation at hand. The 5th revival was in 2005 at the Ethel Barrymore Theatre with Sarah Paulson as Laura and Jessica Lange as Amanda. There's a 30-minute interview with the cast online that I watched, but overall did not glean a ton about the specific production from it, and I'm also baffled as to why the library did not decide to archive this one given the casting. Then there's the 2010 off-Broadway revival at the Laura Pels Theatre owned by Roundabout. This was the first stage production of the show that I ended up seeing. It was my favorite of the 3 because the directorial vision of the show was so strong and so many choices were made that I was really interested in what was happening. They made Tom more strongly a Tennessee Williams self-insert in several different ways. The first being that he's visibly an alcoholic, the second that he's very clearly gay to the point where he and Laura have an equal level of crush on Jim, which also created an interesting dichotomy in the scenes between the two of them of like what the American dream style masculinity heteronormativity looks like versus Tom's queerness and almost forced upon him masculinity and becoming the man of the house. And the third thing is that instead of having him speak to the audience during his soliloquies, he's at the typewriter writing this play and reading the text out to himself, testing it out to see how it feels, sometimes not liking what he has to say, which means that he's also present in the scenes where Tom normally would not be physically present, kind of overseeing what's going on, which at first makes it feel like he's complicit in what's happening to Laura as it's happening, which is interesting. They also staged it so that when he came in drunk, Laura was actively afraid of him. And there were lots of situations where she was clearly acting happy about things and acting engaged because she was just trying to keep the peace. In a way that made it seem like she was more afraid of him, like she loved him, but she was scared of him at the same time. And her frailty didn't read as frailty, like in most productions. It instead read like a person who's been traumatized enough that her startle reflex is through the roof and she knows that she needs to get out, but she's too stressed trying to maintain reality to be able to make a plan on how to escape. Meanwhile, this Amanda seemed generally unaware that she's pushing people's buttons and thought she was being silly or loving or genuine and didn't pick up on the fact that her kids were increasingly frustrated by her, and she also missed all of the lines that were sarcastic. She did not understand that there was sarcasm happening. The one thing that did confuse me a little bit was they had him play a Kyrie on the Victrola for his first monologue that then came back for the closing monologue, and they had church bells noting what time it was in the morning that he stumbles home drunk, and there was occasional prayer imagery throughout while playing up the fact that Tom thought it was weird to pray before dinner, which definitely had implications about regret and a feeling of wrongdoing and maybe something about repression and claustrophobia because the church and repression often come hand in hand. But I didn't entirely pick up what the directorial vision was there, but there definitely there were lots of ideas happening in this version. I thought it was very, very interesting. Next we have the 2013 production. This is the 6th revival with Cherry Jones as Amanda and Celia Keenan-Bolger as Laura at the Booth Theater. And the best way that I can describe this production is that Tennessee Williams would have absolutely loved it. It was a very classic set with some artistic liberties, mostly sticking closely to the script, as did the overall production. I found myself not taking many notes because it felt standard, but that is in and of itself a specific directing choice. My one critique of this production that is actually at its core a criticism of the theatrical education system, but bear with me, is the movement profile. Stephen Hoggett was the movement director for this production. You may know him as one of the movement directors for Curious Incident. He also did the recent Sweeney Todd revival. He's a genius. I love his work. Anytime his name is on something, I get really excited. But there's also something really interesting to me about the fact that he movement directed Curious Incident, then the ART production of this Menagerie, and then the West End transfer of Curious, just given the overall disability history in theater and whatnot. But anyway, when a movement language for a piece is introduced, actors in said piece often automatically become hyper aware of their bodies to a point where they feel unnaturally still or controlled or dance-like in their movement in a way a regular everyday human probably wouldn't be. And this is actually a critique of the wider education system because we've gotten increasingly strict about things like fidgeting and actors neutral over the past few decades, in tandem with an increased use of this aesthetic of an almost doll-like actors neutral that can then become anything in musicals in particular, which has made a lot of actors, particularly those earlier in their careers and therefore more attached to what they learned in school, appear flatter on stage because they're lacking in physical idiosyncrasies. All of which to say, that is happening in the show, or at least seems to be happening, which could have been deliberate in that, like, it added to the feeling of things being static and slow, but for me, it felt like it kind of detached me from the piece a little bit because I didn't feel like I was looking at people, especially because Laura's limp felt sort of dreamlike and dance-like and deliberate rather than an actual mobility issue, which are not gonna be fluid and, you know, perfectly choreographed, which is probably a very deliberate choice. It just wasn't my personal favorite, particularly given the history of people saying her limp isn't real or focusing on what it represents rather than the fact that actual people limp sometimes. But all that being said, this did seem to relax as the production went on, and I have noticed the more things that I watch at the archives versus the slime tutorials of shows that I watch for research, that archive performances tend to feel generally more uptight and nervous than other runs of the show might be. And I would assume this is just the pressure of, oh my gosh, the show's gonna be archived for eternity, I can't screw it up. So this may have been a this performance specific thing rather than a general situation for the overall production, but my review still stands as my review. The one thing I did love about this production, however, is Laura's autonomy. Yes, of course, she's fragile, and in this one is particularly portrayed as quite youthful, almost childlike. She gives off like Wendy Darling if Wendy had an anxiety disorder energy, which is funny because I think Celia played Wendy in Peter and the Star Kid. Anyway, but yeah, she's also sort of the glue to this household. Cherry Jones's Amanda is reminiscing distinctly in a way that feels like Amanda's husband was not just an alcoholic, but also like a manipulative abuser, and she's absolutely haunted by memories of this and is coping with it by sticking in other happier memories to try to replace the ones that are actually filling her head. And while Tom protects and takes care of Laura frequently, he's already haunted a bit by his guilt for planning to leave, and the night when he comes home intoxicated, Laura is the one who waits up for him, who helps him inside, who takes off his shoes, who tucks him in. Her struggles felt less like learned helplessness and more like she's so tightly wound that sometimes she just physically cannot move or she will fall apart. The other thing that was interesting was that this was not an overconfident Jim. He's just like a guy trying to make his way in the world, which made him being sort of patronizing to her, less condescending, and more like he was giving advice to her that he actually kind of meant for himself and like he's projecting things onto her. And then at the end, their kiss was involved to the degree that I felt like Jim was warring with his inner, I am a good man and promise to marry Betsy and I will stand by that promise, but man, if I were single right now and if I were a worse man, I would call that off and go for Laura. Their chemistry was really, really strong. And then in 2017, we have the 7th revival, which is directed by Sam Gold, starring Sally Field as Amanda and Madison Ferris, a wheelchair user, as Laura. And this was at the Belasco Theater. This is the first time a wheelchair user had ever played a principal character on Broadway, and for some reason this production was not archived by the library, which feels both rude and like it's distinctly targeting me. This version was controversial. In all fairness, every major production of the show that has tried to do literally anything with it has been controversial because everybody has opinions as to how it's supposed to go, and you're gonna get flamed by a solid portion of the critics no matter what you do. Not to mention that this was a complete reconstruction of the show, which is a concept that usually works off Broadway but is super hit or miss when it's on Broadway, just given what people expect from Broadway shows, especially because this was somewhat marketed as like, hey, an old-timey play everybody loves with Sally Field as Amanda, that didn't really emphasize disability or reimagining in the marketing at all whatsoever, so people came in expecting something completely different than what they got, and the fact that they had to then confront a lot of prejudices that they may not have wanted to confront, with also not necessarily having the language to confront those prejudices because there weren't like talkbacks or media about it in addition to the show, and the language obviously itself isn't in the show. It ended up causing some issues with audiences. And so unfortunately, most of the critics who didn't like the version decided to entirely blame it on the fact that Laura's being played by a disabled person. I'm not going to read you excerpts of the reviews because they're very upsetting and hate crimes, frankly, but the general vibe was that the wheelchair took them out of the story, it was distracting, it made them uncomfortable, etc. Actually, scratch that, not just the wheelchair, the fact that Madison spent a lot of time outside of the wheelchair, just like existing and moving in the way that disabled people move, they found that to be uncomfortable and distracting and all of that kind of stuff. This version of the show was stripped down, which is saying something since it's already a fairly minimalist show, and directly pointed towards class issues, specifically with the fact that the apartment is inaccessible to Laura, and also how Amanda's denial of her daughter's disability, while at the same time accommodation of some pieces of it causes real harm. They opened the show with her climbing up the fire escape stairs with her mother hauling the wheelchair. This Laura is kind of centered around the idea of not why is Laura shy and fragile, but instead why does everybody keep telling her that she is shy and fragile? She has opinions, she makes them clear, she's very visibly the glue that is barely holding this family together. They also gave her significant sex appeal and real chemistry in the gentleman caller scene, which is fantastic. And a lot of people felt this version wasn't true to the text. I would argue that maybe people are comfortable with a very specific view of what Laura's disability and personality have to be, which is historically what we always see, but also not entirely backed up by the text, which can be interpreted in many different ways. They just didn't like this particular reading of the text because the other one feels more comfortable to them because it fits within their stereotypical understanding of what disability is and what disability should look like. Not to mention that seeing non-disabled people portray disabled people feels safer for an audience because they know the person isn't actually disabled, and there's some shame around freak show history baked into that, which I won't get into right now, but our theater industry has not unpacked that in the slightest. But that is what I gleaned from talking to people who had seen it, information I found on the interwebs, and of course the people who played Laura gave me the most information because they were in it. Anyway, our last adaptation for the day is the 2020 BBC radio play that I listened to. Both the Tom and the Laura felt like they were under the age of 25, which is notable. The Laura didn't sound frail at all, just a little nervous, which I think that I liked this a lot. It felt less like she was a character and more like she was a real person. And that's literally all that I have in my notes for this one. So great, let's talk disability. The primary critique, and the one that I knew about the show long before I knew literally anything else about the show, is that Laura exists to be saintly and fragile. She and the Glass Menagerie are reflections of each other, something pure and pristine and beautiful, but meant to stay safely on display and be observed, something separated from society and wholly untouchable that simply is rather than does. She's often put on a pedestal and described by reviewers as too good for this world, along with other deeply patronizing, infantilizing, Tiny Tim-esque commentary, which is somewhat reflected in the script with how she's continuously being told that she is special. But like, special in a way where she needs to make up for being special because maybe she's actually a little bit too special. There's also something to be said about the trend of naming stories after the disabled character or a direct reference to the disabled character. But then the story is actually about how the main character is impacted by the disabled character, who is relegated to being a one-dimensional trope, but also this play is written before that trend really took off, so that feels a little bit like an unfair criticism to make, but I am going to point it out all the same. Many commentators also believe that Laura exists in the show to be a proxy for Tom's, and therefore William's, guilt about leaving home, which sort of exacerbates her infantilization as the poor unfortunate soul who needed saving but was left behind. The story equates life as a disabled person with isolation and loneliness, where she gets a pity kiss from a guy who was never really interested in her in the first place and then leaves her behind. She may be beautiful, but she's undesirable, a leftover person never meant to find somebody outside of herself. Her two nicknames are Blue Roses, directly related to her disability, and Shakespeare's sister, directly related to her brother rather than to her as an individual. It equates life as a disabled person to one of monotony and inability to really do anything. She spends all of her time sitting at home doing nothing and looking longingly out the window, and it's constantly mentioned throughout the play about how much of a waste that kind of life is. Ew. It also really relies on the concept of disability as metaphor. Her disability exists for a reason. It represents something to teach a non-disabled audience a lesson about humanity rather than to exist because disabled people exist. Not to teach people lessons, but simply to be disabled people, because we're a variety of humanity and we're great. The literary use of disability at best advances the narrative and metaphor without addressing the lived experience of disability itself, and at worst cycles disability back into a cultural lexicon that perpetuates the rejection and repression of disability identity. The other thing that irks me, and maybe this originated in this text, and maybe it's something commentators have been saying long enough that people just assume it is true, but there's this pervasive idea that a broken body equates to a broken mind, in the theater industry in general, but also in the specific text, effectively that the physical disability of her limp has expanded out to become a disability of the mind, with some even suggesting that maybe her limp is just a psychosomatic thing that she convinces herself is real to feel safer in her isolation. And this metaphorical broken body, broken mind concept is particularly pervasive in the theater, especially in physical theater, which focuses on how the way a body takes up space demonstrates to an audience the internal world of that character. Like Richard III has a hunched back and a limb difference. Yeah, that's because he's crooked in the head, which is why he's evil, like that kind of stuff. And you spend hours and hours in theater training trying to try on different disabled physicalities to see what you can learn about the psyche of your character, and it's such an issue, and I'm not going to go down our education system is hot garbage rabbit hole, because I already have a thesis video series about that. I'll link it above. Anyway, all of which to say, this idea really bothers me. But the most irksome piece of this is that this interpretation is so close to realizing that mental disability exists, and that Laura clearly has one. Like, most analyses are like, oh, her disability is her limp, and also she's so shy and nervous that it impacts her day-to-day life. Congrats! You've just described an anxiety disorder, which is a disability. Laura automatically felt very autistic coded to me in how she's hyper aware of how she is perceived socially, but doesn't quite know how to change that for herself, and how she fidgets with things, how she's always observing and trying to make sense of the world around her before she puts herself into it. She recharges by doing things others may find monotonous or pointless, but to her create order and structure and calm. But she also walks that very thin line between the presentation of CPTSD and autism, and I want to honor the fact that she is heavily based on Rose, who we know had schizophrenia, and not replace that with a different disability. But then I was reminded of the fact that Rose was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1937, which is important because this is a time when autism as a word was used to describe a symptom of a schizophrenia that was being socially withdrawn, self-focused, and seemingly disconnected from reality. Autism as a separate diagnostic term did not become a thing until after Rose had gotten her lobotomy. I found a 2012 article titled Not Like All the Other Horses, Neurodiversity and the Case of Rose Williams that analyzed writings about Rose and her trait profile and recontextualized them as autistic traits, particularly pointing to things like atypical play, preference for being alone, documented repeating of phrases that could be echolalia, and often not responding when she was being called by name. They also talked about the fact that Rose's inability to read social cues and to think flexibly resulted in an odd mixture of inappropriate sexual forwardness and puritanical moral rigidity. And her atypical ways of speaking about and handling sex and sexuality were seen as socially unacceptable to the point where it's assumed that this was probably the primary thing that led her mother to choose the lobotomy as treatment. So an autistic Laura based on Rose actually makes the most sense from an analytical and historical perspective. But what I found most interesting in my readings on this play was how non-disabled siblings of disabled people talk about what fantastic representation this is, while disabled people, by and large, heavily criticize it. There's an interesting phenomenon in storytelling, one that is particularly rampant of late in the autism parent community, which is phrasing I've always hated. You're not parenting autism, you're parenting an autistic kid. But it's the belief that somebody with proximity to disability therefore understands it to the degree that the disabled person does, because they too are impacted by it, and therefore they can't be ableist, they deserve to speak on the matter, and they intrinsically get it. And don't get me wrong, I think conversations around lack of caregiver support are super important, but the statistical ratio of actually disabled people telling disabled stories needs to be significantly higher than the non-disableds telling disabled stories. And I think that it's so interesting. There's one particular article I'm thinking about that I won't name because I'm about to rip into it, but there was a 95-page thesis paper that I read by a twin brother of a disabled person detailing how this play's acknowledgement of the vastly negative impact disability has on everybody around it is saying the quiet part out loud that needs to be said more because it's never talked about. And also a lot of the other verbiage in the article made me want to throw things, but that's beside the point. I bring this up because this author, as the sibling of a disabled person, felt like the representation they're seeing in this play is authentic, which makes sense because this story is told through the lens of the sibling to a disabled person as written by the sibling to a disabled person. And so when we talk about truth in this play, there's a lot of language around truth, and my immediate response is to say this may be the truth for him, but that truth is warped by significant and wholly uninterrogated ableism. And in that era, that wouldn't even be even remotely a conversation, but seeing a more recent example of somebody actively saying they get it when they don't get it in a very harmful way makes that warped lens of looking at Laura even clearer to me. Which then brings in the question of, sure, this is somebody's truth, but then does it need to make its way into the literary canon? There have been many things that I've reviewed or just read or watched on my own that involve disability that are true stories, whether they're memoirs or films that dramatize memoirs. Those I usually critique a little less harshly since they're usually somewhat Hollywoodified, but these often have a lot of internalized ableism from the narrator that is firmly baked into the story to a harmful degree, or that frame the story in a way that is very harmful. And while yes, the facts of the matter may be true, just because it's fact doesn't mean that I'm going to like it or recommend it to people because it contributes to stereotype in a way that is perceived as non-stereotype lived experience, which therefore further bakes stereotypes into people's minds as fact. It becomes a situation where I go, cool story. Why do we have to add it to the media canon? Why does this need to be here? Which is kind of what I felt about this play initially. But this is a moment where we take our biases and we try to throw them out the window. My window's over there. Throwing them out the window. Because that's all well and good and noble, but also, at what point are we just contributing to censorship then? At what point are we deciding what stories are and are not allowed to be told and in what manner? At what point are we deciding what precisely an audience should be allowed to see or hear based on how we think they're going to perceive it? And this is incredibly complicated. Obviously, there's so much nuance and mess in this idea because I think we can be cognizant of the stories we're telling and shaping ways to tell them that cause less harm without it being censorship, and we should definitely be doing that. A great example being how we handle the really, really dark side of depression in media because there are documented consequences for different kinds of mental health portrayals. But simply for the thought experiment, who are we to decide what should and should not be in the literary canon? And to take that even further, if we are deciding what should and should not be in the literary canon, are we then spoon-feeding media to people, which then furthers the media literacy crisis we're already in? And at that point, do we need to just let media be messy and instead focus on teaching people tools to speak critically and analytically about the media they consume and change conversations around it instead? And media representation goes in cycles where people get put in as coded characters, they then show up as characters who almost over-explain their minority identity, and that's their only character trait, and they feel deeply sanitized and clinical, and then we get to a point where they can just exist as humans without question, at which point people start to critique the fact that they're not in-depth enough as representation, and so then we simultaneously see characters over-explaining their minority identities and characters who are coded as that identity so as to make a different kind of commentary, and the cycle continues back around the circle. And right now with disability representation, we are asking for it to be more explicitly handled and somewhat sanitized, particularly with mental disability, as we're seeing the rise of explicit autistic representation and anxiety representation, and companies are realizing that this is less of a risk and in fact somewhat profitable. But I found that disabled people are currently quite afraid of deliberately messy disability representation that balances the good and the bad and asks the hard questions, because we are so used to it always being negative that now we want it to be unequivocally positive to an almost inhuman and unnatural degree. Literary disability studies scholars have, in a way, ourselves overcompensated. We have demanded a kind of overcoming narrative in art to the extent that our examination of disability representation has attempted to demarcate a strict line between the subversive and the stereotypical, the positive and the problematic. So what if, instead, and hear me out, we instead look at Menagerie not with the concern about the stereotypes Laura represents, and instead presume the competence of our audience, given that this play has been around for over 80 years at this point, and say, what if our audience knows all of the tropes at play and they feel weird about them too? What if everybody actually knows the true story underneath the story, but societally we all have to talk about it this way when we all know that we're actually listening to subtext? Particularly with this play that feels outdated, that feels like a period piece, that has so many other things encoded and tied into it that they couldn't talk about then either. So what does that mean for Laura? And in fact, are we somewhat continuing stereotypes about this character by only looking at her through the stereotyped lens and assuming that everybody else will see her at face value that way too? One of Tom's first lines is, "I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion." And for that unnamed author I talked about earlier, he saw that truth in the pain and claustrophobia of this piece because he associated growing up as the twin to a disabled person with pain and claustrophobia. But you get from anything what you bring into it. So if we start bringing a different mirror to this piece instead, a slightly less defensive one perhaps, what's gonna happen? We'll start with something my friend said to me when I was talking to him about my frustrations with this play, which is that something being true does not mean the narrator is trustworthy. We can acknowledge that Tom is a fundamentally unreliable narrator. What he sees to be truth is not the objective truth. In fact, with Laura specifically, his view of her, his memories are heavily tainted by his guilt for leaving her. They're also very much tainted by the fact that he was effectively her primary caregiver for much of her life. So he's going to see her in a particular light that might not actually be who she is outside of that context or that shade of meaning. And if we go back to I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion, I would argue that there are two different degrees of truth here. The illusion is a truth. That's the subjective stuff. And underneath that lies the more universal objective human truths that are the actual subtext and meat of this play. And focusing primarily on critiquing the surface level presentation of that might, it could be argued, completely miss the point. Or it could be argued, it is precisely the point. I also want to push back on the idea I said earlier about it being a non-disabled person writing about disability, because Tennessee Williams was a disabled man. He was sick frequently growing up, he struggled with addiction, which is a disability, and he also once, in writing about his sister, stated that she had the same precarious balance of nerves that I have to live with. And given that autism is somewhat genetic, and autistic people are more likely to struggle with addiction, and his father also struggled with addiction, and this very, very autobiographical play has dysfunctional neurodivergent family dynamics written all over it, this all makes a lot of sense to me. The other important thing to note is that throughout his lifetime, homosexuality was functionally disability. The DSM did not appear until 1952 with sexual deviancy as a category, but it was viewed scientifically as disability for at least 50 years beforehand, so it was very much in the cultural lexicon as such. Disability history and queer history are very tightly intertwined. I have a video about some of that up here if you're interested, which you should, because it's super cool. But the ableist call could obviously still come from inside the house. He can also be somewhat understanding of his own disability while dismissive of others, because he certainly didn't see himself as a disabled man, but he did see himself as dangerously close enough to Rose that he feared becoming like her for his entire life. So I would argue that he was on some level aware. But this idea of Tom being a thinly veiled Tennessee, a disabled man, then reflects Laura's existence differently as well. I'm working on a paper right now about a show that I will leave unnamed for the moment, where a character is explicitly disabled and has a, let's just say, lightly concerning storyline, while her sister is implicitly disabled and has a storyline I would consider to be excellent disability representation if viewed as such, but usually it's not. But therefore, if a production were to acknowledge that both sisters are disabled and cast them and deliberately stage them in such a manner, that then puts the harmful narrative of the younger sister in question, since it is now offset by a different disabled character faced with a similar life scenario but who chooses a different outcome for herself, which I would argue more or less fixes the problems of the piece and updates them to a modern audience. And I think that could also be the case with this show. If we read Tom as queer, and we could also say as autistic or autistic coded, but two really common things that look like autistic coding and aren't are being an unreliable narrator and being queer coded, so it really could go either way. But anyway, if we read Tom as an outcast because of his disability, and we read Laura as an outcast because of her disability, it puts them on a more level playing field where it becomes easier to see the other mechanisms at play here, like gender roles, or the capitalistic post-Great Depression hellscape. Like, if we look at the intersection of gender and disability for a moment, womanhood is seen as the first disability. Aristotle literally wrote about how the female is the deformed male. And under patriarchy, a woman is defined based on her proximity to men and by her desirability, since her desirability will make her closer to and wanted by men. And that desirability includes attractiveness as well as ability to be a homemaker and all the things that entails. So here we have this character who is a disabled woman, meaning that she may be perceived as having a harder time being a homemaker, maybe having a harder time having children. Her mother also tries to stuff her bra to make her more desirable on the beauty front. And there's some fear there, not just that because she doesn't have a man to be defined by outside of her brother who already has one foot out the door, which is an issue for literal security in this era, but also around the fact that she is unmarried and has no prospects and isn't doing anything her mother can brag about, and how that may impede Amanda's ability to climb the social ladder, which is clearly her underlying goal throughout this play, whether she's going to admit that or not, because all she does is imagine when she was a higher class and dream of that time coming back. I will also mention that Laura's infantilization as a character was inevitable regardless of ability, simply based on her position as a young unmarried woman in this era. I think the disability compounded this, but there's a lot of intersectionality at play here. And much of that infantilization comes not from the narrative, but from Amanda continuously calling her a little girl and treating her like she is incapable of doing anything on her own. But more on that later. Speaking of this era, the other important thing to tie back into this is when it takes place. Times of economic uncertainty create cutthroat competition for things like employment and relationships and marriage in ways that exacerbate marginalization. And poverty itself is inherently disabling, something that was pointed out with the issue's economy nominating Laura in the 2017 Sam Gold production. And there's significant discussion in the disability rights world about how capitalism itself is inherently disabling. Disability was created as a functional social category because of the rise of capitalism, and I therefore need to categorize the group of people who could not work as the other. And if we start to expand our view of this family out further, we do start to see that actually all three of them really only go to one or two places and primarily spend their time spinning on a metaphorical hamster wheel at home, trying to cope with reality in their own ways that avoid reality because they have neither the time nor the energy to do anything other than try to get by. Williams created his stories around dysfunctional family relationships in a disabled social context, where he focuses on the bottom of society people to illustrate how the society can be so irrationally oppressive that it can cripple the human cultural ideology and social perception to the point of complete mental breakdown and failure to participate in any form of society. It's not that Laura's disability alone is inherently isolating. They're all deeply isolated. And then they're all angry at each other for being so isolated without looking inwards, feeling almost like they can't solve their own problems, so maybe if they solve the problems of the people around them, that'll make their life easier and continue them on forward momentum rather than the current day in, day out slog. And in fact, the story framing Laura as the only isolated one through Tom's lens is commentary on its own about individualism and isolation. Also, to bring in Laura's so-called psychosomatic aspects back in the mix, that's a word that is objectively morally neutral and scientifically accurate when used properly, and it does not mean that the experience of something isn't any less real to the person who's experiencing it, but it's always used in such a derogatory and dismissive manner that just saying it makes my skin crawl a little bit. But something I saw in a lot of analyses of Laura's character were the body-mind problem. Some people seeing her as having a limp and anxiety, and those two things being separate, unrelated situations. Others seeing her as having a limp that became anxiety, or anxiety that became a limp, but as a sort of one-time situation that just happened and is now stuck like that, waiting to be pushed back in the other direction and be fixed. And obviously, very few people treat her mental disability as a disability, so they talk about her limp as something she can't ever get over, but her anxiety is something she needs to snap out of, which is really funny to me because that's not how that works. But I didn't see any commentary as to her having a disabled body-mind as one cohesive unit that is ever-changing based on the situation, and also not something that is separated from the world around her. I imagine that her anxiety very much does impact her limp, and her limp impacts her anxiety. I know on days when I'm in more pain, I'm hyper aware of my disability and I feel like the world is harder to navigate and I get more anxious. And I know that sometimes when my anxiety is really high, my body decides to throw me a medical curveball as explanation for why my brain doesn't feel great. And honestly, it's really hard to tell what's controlling what and therefore how to manage it. But it's because it's a unified system where everything impacts everything else. And sure, maybe Laura's level of anxiety about some things is a little high for the situation at hand, but she does feel it to that degree for a reason. To put it super simply, we're gonna do a little scenario here. Imagine your friend grew up going to their older brother's basketball games and they would always get really scared by the buzzer because it's really, really, really loud. And you don't know this, so you bring that person to a tennis match inside of a gymnasium because some of the girls that are on the team are pretty, and then your friend starts to have a panic attack. Does that situation to an outside viewer seem irrational for the situation? Absolutely, but is it completely warranted given that person's history? Also absolutely. Is that level of anxiety around a thing now becoming a problem that is preventing them from participating in something they may want to participate in but feel like they cannot? Yeah, maybe, but the solution isn't to tell them that they're being irrational or brute force them into doing the thing. The solution is to have a conversation, try to figure out maybe where things are coming from, see if that's a thing the person actually wants to put in the effort to overcome, or if they're genuinely cool with just not going to sports games. And that's fine. And then support them and let them lead what they want that to look like. Do they want to see the tennis matches? Great. Stay for one set next time and then go get ice cream. Next time, stay for 2 sets. Maybe after the season, try going to a basketball game with earplugs in and realize that it's actually usually pretty logical when the buzzer noise is going to happen if you pay attention and you aren't terrified the whole time. Or if actually sports don't mean that much to that person at all and they were only going to it for the purpose of seeing some pretty girls, they might be just as content going to a lesbian bar or a climbing gym or a pottery class. And to them, it may not feel like they're missing out on anything. They may just hate sports. They're just in a different direction. Not every person needs to experience sports games to be a content human being. So to bring the metaphor back to Laura, the basketball games, long gone at this point. She's avoiding sports as much as humanly possible, but the more sports-related stuff that's appearing, the more she's closing up tighter and tighter and tighter because everybody is trying to brute force her fear out of her rather than trying to find the root of that fear and maybe being willing to change their own behavior, which is backfiring because every time she tries and something goes wrong, she uses that as another point of data for not trying things and everybody around her is blaming it on her. And then the alternatives that she does find joy in, the proverbial rock climbing and pottery classes, are being minimized by everybody else around her, and she's being told that those things aren't as valuable as the option that everybody else thinks she needs to participate in and learn how to like. Sure, she probably sees her disability as a much larger issue than what we may see it as, but she's being told from every single direction constantly that because of her limp, she is unsuitable for society. She is incapable, she is undesirable, nobody wants to be her friend or spend time with her, and so she's internalized this and it has become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we see over the course of the play how this comes from every single direction around her. Amanda's continuous goal is for her kids to have stability and happiness, but on the very specific terms in which she defines stability and happiness that don't really seem to suit who either of our children actually are, and refusing to accept that they might be a little bit different because in this economy, different does not give you comfort in the particular social status in the way that she wants for them. She's also constantly undermining Laura's confidence by reminding Laura that she's incapable of taking care of herself, that they as women are dependent, but also that she, Amanda, can take care of herself. So really, Laura's dependent. Amanda denies her autonomy by planning every single thing that Laura is going to do, to the point where there is some semblance of learned helplessness there. She's never had control over her life, so what's the point of trying to exert some? And her mother's insistence that she is not crippled, that she just has a little defect that she can overcome by learning other skills, clearly implies that being crippled is something to be ashamed of, something to hide and not ever be spoken about. And it's very clear to everybody that while she denies its existence, she finds the prospect of the reality of having a disabled daughter who may never marry utterly terrifying, made even clearer by her usage of the word crippled in her final speech to Tom. She's known this the whole time, she just refuses to acknowledge it because then maybe it won't be real. Then we have Tom, who's on the other side of the coin, where he doesn't see an expansive future for her, but he tries to be nice about it. He reinforces the idea that she can't do lots of things to an almost definitive degree. We don't even notice that she's crippled anymore, which has an implication that other people will see her that way and won't want her, and so we shouldn't push her too hard because she's just going to be rejected at the end of the day. And the fact that she's regularly heard Amanda tell Tom that he needs to stay no matter how miserable he may be until Laura can be taken care of makes Laura feel like she's a burden on the family, and it's her fault, or rather her disability's fault, that her brother, who is the closest person that she loves, is so unhappy. And then we see Jim O'Connor waltz in, the perfect representation of the modern man, aka conformity, modernity, the capitalistic bootstraps mentality, and mansplains her own disability to her, diminishing her disabilities and blaming her for feeling inferior and for struggling. And while some of what he says does have truth to it, and it usually comes across more kindly than the other people, that doesn't necessarily mean it's any less patronizing. One of the papers I read, titled Gender Disability in Bahram Tavakoli's Here Without Me and Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, apologies if I pronounced that person's name wrong, talked about Amanda and Jim specifically as characters who perceive conformity to social norms as the key to social and capitalistic success, and therefore police others into that conformity in a way that does not reflect or take into consideration their individuality, which sort of takes this claustrophobic, repressed household dynamic and moves the responsibility from the individuals in the situation who are simply treading water to the wider socio-political structures that are forcing them into these positions. So then, acknowledging that what we would see as a revolutionary disabled character in today's lens would be deeply anachronistic if placed in a work from the 1940s, can we look at Laura's refusal of the status quo around her as actually being quite revolution in its own right? First of all, she's in a mainstream school as a visibly disabled person. This was not common back then. She was likely the only disabled person who was not an elderly person that she'd ever seen in her entire life. When I spoke to Carrie Cox, who understudied Laura on Broadway in 2017 and later played her again at the Guthrie, she mentioned that she'd always assumed that Laura's disability was related to having polio as a child, in that it would have been common in this era, and we know that she struggled and may still struggle with pleurosis, which is a lung condition, and she has a leg brace. In this era, many children who survived polio were taught to do everything they could to hide that fact, or they were homeschooled or educated in hospitals or other residential facilities. So the fact that she is in a public school to begin with is a massive deal and takes serious strength and also pushing from her family members to even make that possible. Also, a thing you may have forgotten about, because I sure did, is the fact that Laura spends 6 weeks going out every single day on walks by herself. I went in the art museum and the birdhouses and the zoo. I visited the penguins every day. Sometimes I did without lunch and went to the movies. Lately, I've been spending most of my afternoons in the Jewel Box, that big glass house where they raise the tropical flowers. Some have suggested the hopelessness of those ventures in the fact that rather than escaping this small static reality she can control at home, when she's outside of the house, she is going to another static representation of reality that she can control rather than actually venturing out into the real world, because the animals on display at the zoo, the plants are on display at the Jewel Box, those are very much separated and untouchable as her glass menagerie is at home. And I think that is a valid take if you want to look at it metaphorically. She goes from one zoo to another and whatnot. But the thing is, interactions with animals at the zoo are actually a much different and less controllable experience than polishing her glass animals. So for me, this actually feels like an important stepping stone. I know for me, doing something scary that involves something something I'm interested in is how I discovered those things aren't that scary and I'm more willing to venture out to different things that I'm less interested in. It also feels somewhat dismissive to decide which places out of the house dictate reality and an expansion of mindset and which don't, because that's very much in the eye of the beholder. Like museums and zoos and greenhouses are places where to some degree she has to interact with other people, at least to enter. She is as much interacting with people and exploring things from around the world as Tom is when he's going to the movies, which is something that he enjoys and is also heavily scolded and minimized about by his mother as well. It's not that she doesn't want to venture out, it's that when she tells her mom happily about the adventures that she goes on, her mother is too busy being angry with her about quitting business college to acknowledge that her daughter significantly expanded her world over the course of a few weeks. It's that her adventures out of the house, which she clearly enjoys, are seen as insignificant and pointless, which makes her so ashamed of enjoying these things, the line between wanting to do something and being ridiculed for it, that it becomes decision paralysis and she no longer goes back out. Also because she no longer has to pretend that she's going to business college, but most Laura's deliver the lines about where she went on her adventures with some reminiscent joy of being out in the world and seeing new things, so clearly that's something she enjoys and wants to do. And in the 1950 film, we see her go to these things, and it's the first time we see her with any emotion other than fear on her face, so it seems like there's more attachment there than just a need to go and hide from her mother, which then points to the fact that the issue is how she's treated for being different rather than the difference itself. There's also something to be said about context. An exotic flower is not exotic when it's in the rainforest. A penguin isn't weird when it's in Antarctica. This argument has been used to say that she goes from being an animal in her glass menagerie to an animal in a real menagerie, but I would argue that a blue rose would not be so out of place in a house of tropical flowers. The line about the penguins is also interesting because socially in the last 5 years or so, a penguin is a shortcut metaphor for autism because I think it was a Tumblr post. I don't actually know. Don't quote me on that. A story that gained a lot of traction about how being diagnosed feels like learning you're a penguin in a family of sparrows. So I very much see that line as being recontextualized to a modern disabled audience in a very interesting way. We could also argue that Laura is content being peculiar. She's just ashamed of that fact because everybody else tells her it's something to be ashamed of. Throughout the story, Amanda is constantly stuck in the past and Tom and Jim are stuck in the future as their escapes from current reality, while Laura is firmly in the present, living day by day and moment by moment. I like to imagine that after the play ends, she goes back out in her adventures and maybe meets a nice gardener at the Jewel Box who teaches her about plants and gets her a job working with them. We could also see Laura's easy acceptance of the broken unicorn not as a way to placate the emotions of Jim, who she wants to impress, but actually as subtly acknowledging the fact that things break and it doesn't make them any less worthy, simply a different variant. It's not like a unicorn with a horn broken off is a horse. It's a unicorn with a horn broken off. As much similar to the horses as it still is different, and that doesn't make it any less of a unicorn. And giving him the broken piece of glass also shows that she doesn't need this escape anymore because she has now interacted with somebody who's willing to reassure her and compliment her and lets her be a full person. Does he also claim to understand her disabilities more than she does? Absolutely. I don't really like him very much, but he has a break from the rest of the insular house situation she's stuck in and lets her see a sliver of what could be and how she could be with somebody who she matches with. Hopefully a nicer person than Jim. See my dream man of a gardener point from earlier. Alternatively, we decide that both siblings are queer and she meets a hot plant lesbian. I would also be content with this outcome. The play concluding on her blowing out the candles is often analyzed as an extinguishing of hope, which for Tom, it is. But he's guilty enough about leaving her that in his mind her whole destiny is determined by his abandonment, and so Tom forgets that her life will continue even though he's no longer a part of it. The candles, lit in service of Jim's expected wooing of Laura, are no longer needed at the end of the play. Laura, awakened to her own worth and the possibilities of a future outside her imagination, is no longer compelled to cling to the dream of her high school sweetheart. Instead, she can blow out the candles of an unnecessary fiction and transition to a new part of her life. Also, during his final monologue, we see a silent conversation between Amanda and Laura, where Amanda is comforting her and is punctuated by a smile from Laura. Depending on the staging, this is typically the first time we ever see her try to regulate her emotions via companionship rather than through self-isolation, which also implies hope for what might come next for her. Or in the 2017 staging, Amanda cries and puts her head in Laura's lap, and Laura comforts her, further showing her strength and power as the rock of this family, and maybe even becoming the next man of the house. One of my favorite things that I read for this video was a chapter in disability theater and modern drama recasting modernism titled Shattering the Glass Menagerie, which is the script for a multimedia performance art piece by Terry Galloway, M. Shane Grant, Ben Gunter, and Carrie Sandall that was first performed in 2003 that basically works its way through the disability-specific and queer-specific text of this play in a sort of I guess, Statler and Waldorf commentary kind of way, where Terry and Carrie are sitting and discussing the academic analysis of the play and their own personal opinions as disabled and disabled queer people. They talk about how there was something to be envied about this character because she is beautiful, and it's so rare that disabled characters get to be beautiful. She's the first time they'd seen an explicitly disabled person in a play before. There's also something enviable about her because she gets to be fragile. She isn't expected to be strong or to constantly justify her existence every minute of every day, because there is something, I don't want to say seductive, but that's kind of the idea, about not having to handle every aspect of your disability 24/7 and having somebody else take care of it to some degree. Like, in reality, when that happens, it usually doesn't feel great because there's a level of trust that needs to be there, since you're giving up autonomy and being vulnerable that can go in very bad directions very quickly. Also, the internalized ableism of I'm a burden shows up really quickly, which you can very much see is the primary issue for Laura here, but most disabled folks I know still have that little piece of them that's like, okay, but what if I was allowed to let my guard down entirely for just a little bit, just as a break? It's kind of like the difference between, as a femme person, walking down the street by yourself at night versus walking down the street with a man by your side, where just that little undercurrent weight of stress is off your shoulders for a bit and you don't quite realize it until the next time you're on the street alone. Kind of like that. We want to feel that, but the disability version sometimes. But we're told by society that doing that is actually making you a burden on other people, and you should be able to handle all your own issues by yourself, because we prioritize individualism to a deeply harmful and wholly unrealistic degree. And even if we cognitively know that, it's still kind of hard to break out of, especially as marginalized people who have been fed this American dream, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everything's gonna be great mindset. That's just like not how things work. There's also this bit that really stuck out to me where Terry says, in some ways the disabled could embrace Laura's fate, or at least re-articulate it. What's wrong with being peculiar, with being different, with being imaginative, with turning your back on capitalistic expectation, with wanting to be pitied, wanting empathetic, imaginative understanding of your differences? And Carrie says, come on, Terry. History shows us that the non-disabled relieve themselves of the burden of disability by trying to eliminate the disabled themselves. Pity is one step away from contempt, which is one step away from hate, which is one step away from eugenics, which is one step away from euthanasia, which is one step away from... You see where I'm going with this? In poll after poll, people say they'd rather be dead than disabled. Consider the fact that Williams based the character of Laura on his schizophrenic sister Rose, who was institutionalized most of her life and later lobotomized. Some good pity did her in real life. Also consider the fact that after Tom leaves, we have no idea what happens to Laura. In the play's time period, people with disabilities were institutionalized in record numbers, suffered involuntary sterilizations, and most were banned from public schools. Clouding this reality with the haze of Laura's fantasy life is reprehensible. Her fantasy life serves the play dramaturgically as a kind of self-negation. Her peculiar behavior a convenient justification for her loneliness. And Terry says, in my book, that alone makes her unremarkable in any way. Who doesn't use fantasy for self-negation? Who doesn't use peculiar behavior to justify loneliness? And that's what I find to be so radical about her. Her absolute determination not to be. I love it. And Carrie says, I hate it. Laura embodied my worst fears as a disabled girl, that no man would ever love me, that I would never be able to make my way in the world, that I wouldn't have any friends, that I was an embarrassment to my family, that people just patronized me when they told me that my disability was what made me special. Terry then goes on to talk about how, on one level, her lack of productivity is somewhat protest, because under capitalism, the worth of humans is defined by productivity, and she does not fit within that mold and is just as worthy as a human. To which Carrie says something along the lines of, okay, but disabled people can also be employed and successful, and it's frustrating that she doesn't really do anything. She just sits and waits for the story to pass her by. And I firmly agree with all of this, and whatever gray area may be in between, which really reflects the double standards we have for representation, where defiance of stereotype makes them revolutionary, but also falls right into another stereotype, because stereotypes typically exist in the binary. And so the question no longer becomes how can we avoid stereotype, but instead, how can we be conscious of it and turn it from archetype into in-depth personhood? Now, I had the pleasure of interviewing several former Lauras and making this video, specifically disabled former Lauras. Hi everybody, thanks for watching. Because turns out literally everybody has played her at some point. So special thanks to Carrie Cox, Phoebe Fico, Regan Linton, Christine Bruno, and Madison Ferris for all their help and expertise as people who had lived in this character for some time. And one thing that came up in nearly every interview that I thought was interesting was how the instinctual menagerie groan and eye roll comes from the fact that if you're a physically disabled woman or a femme presenting person in acting school, everybody goes, oh my gosh, have you heard of this play? It would be so perfect for you. You should totally play this character. And that's sort of like pigeonholing and forced focus on this play makes everybody want to instinctually hate it and run and or roll in the opposite direction. There's also a lot of difficulty with this character in the historicity of her disability. I feel like as audiences we see historical shows and are aware of when race or queerness or gender is being used in a dated way that, besides using the occasional slur, people don't usually pick up on in regards to disability. But because her disability is so ambiguous and unclear, there's a sort of pressure on the disabled person cast in this role to figure out where their disability disability and her ambiguous disability may overlap and reflect each other, which is something you probably wouldn't think about if you're not in the disability theater realm, but like most disabled actors I know will, one way or another, think about how aspects of their disability may present differently based on what character they're playing and alter that to fit said character. Like somebody may lean into how they walk differently, or might try to mask it, or they might choose one mobility aid or the other, or one kind of stim over the other. And these are all things that we keep in mind. And that actually ends up making it easier if we're playing non-disabled characters that we put disability into, rather than trying to take the disability of a character that already exists and fit it in with our own. And there's a lot of extra effort in the show in particular in trying to sort of translate her historical disability to the modern day and then apply it to yourself and figure out where all of that fits, while acknowledging the pressure and legacy that this character holds, which is incredibly difficult, particularly because most disabled people who end up playing Laura are very, very early in their careers. Which is not to say that we are not capable of doing this. Obviously we are, we crush it every single time, but it puts a lot of weight on the shoulders of a young actor to figure all of this out themselves, often while they're still figuring out the industry for themselves. And I think it's cool that we have such a high difficulty role in existence for disabled people, but also at what cost, particularly when it's a situation where people assume that a disabled person acting as a disabled character is easy and not actually acting, and so they don't get the credit for crushing it to the degree that the non-disableds playing at being disabled in this role tend to get. But then, also, after this play, effectively every other female disabled character in the theater canon is more or less a copy-paste of Laura. The quiet, soft-spoken disabled woman with a rich inner world that she never really tells anybody about is the character we get in effectively everything else. Several of the people I talked to mentioned the monotony of these characters as written by non-disableds that they've played or auditioned for many times since playing Laura, because everybody read this play or saw this play somewhere where they were in school, and it's the only representation of disability on stage that they can remember, so it's the blueprint that they end up using. When we are continuously ignoring great plays by disabled people that don't fall into these same characterizations every single time. So then the issue instead becomes, okay, why this, why now? Why this instead of other things? Why are we obsessed with telling the same story over and over and over again in the same community theater and MFA programs and 7 times on Broadway when we know better now? We have more options now. Why are we stuck with Menagerie? And also cost of living, but that's a deep dive for another month. And that sort of brings us into the now what section of this video, where I would give my opinions on what I would recommend as a dramaturg for this piece, what I would do if I were directing a production, or what I think would be interesting. This bit also usually includes script changes, but changing Tennessee Williams would be sacrilege. I'm not going to do that. But honestly, all I really have for this section is like cast authentically. Whatever authentically may mean for you, for your vision of this piece is up to you, but it better be in the disability category. That's all that I ask. Preferably physical disability, preferably in regards to mobility, but that also is a really wide range of options. I'm particularly interested in the concept of really leaning into the disabled body-mind and where that overlap takes place. Like with an explicitly autistic Laura, for example, there's physicality we associate with autism that is somewhere in the visible mobility difference category, but isn't necessarily your traditional limp. That would be super interesting. If we are going to keep with the idea of an autistic Laura, it also might be interesting to add some more subtext about Amanda's fear of needing to potentially institutionalize her and what that would do to their overall social status as a family. But I think looking back at the adaptation history, whatever directorial ideas happen will be simultaneously loved and hated, and everybody has really strong opinions on how to go about producing the show. And I personally don't have strong opinions about producing the show. I very much feel like after all of this, I'm glad I learned about it and glad I read it. It's been an important part of my life and, you know, made me face some of my own internalized ableism and reflecting on rules I've put in place for my safety as a disabled person that maybe are less about my literal safety, more about a perceived mental safety that I've rationalized as being logical when it's fundamentally holding me back. But I'm also going to be very happy to put this one back on the shelf once this video is done. I don't really have that much affinity toward this as a piece, if that makes any sense. So like when it comes to opinions, I don't have a ton, but I feel like as long as you're working with a disabled actor and you're thinking about what that means for your version of the story, you're deliberate in what story you're telling and all the pitfalls within it, and you're cognizant of the weight the history the show carries, particularly for queer and disabled people, go for it. Because the show's not going away. I think at this point audiences are increasingly uncomfortable with Laura as a character to some degree because they're aware of the stereotypes around her. So if we then lean into that even harder to teach them something new about disabled people and make them sit in that, what's going to happen, right? What if we acknowledge that stereotype is fundamentally unavoidable and avoiding it in one direction leads you to fall into it in another? What does it mean to reclaim messy representation at a time when people are more comfortable with sanitized representation, particularly in the medium of theater where people are already more uncomfortable with it in comparison to when they watch it on TV? How can we play with that? But what I also think is fascinating is that as we're making the shift to focus more on her disability and authentically casting it and, oh man, what do we do about it? We're turning what was a complicated play that has disability in it alongside a lot of other things into a disability representation play. And I would argue that this is a disability play to some degree. It shows how capitalistic structures of repression and oppression disable everybody, particularly along the lines of mental disability. What this play has become in the cultural consciousness lately has instead been focused on fixing Laura as representation, which I think somewhat harms the effectiveness of the rest of the play. But because it has this huge legacy of doing the representation piece so poorly, the instinct to modernize it is to fix it and to hyper-focus on this piece rather than re-look at the entire play holistically and include all of it properly in a way that disproportionately puts a lot of stress and pressure on the shoulders of the often quite young disabled people inhabiting this role. And I don't really have a lot of answers as to what to do with this, other than like we tried to have a lot of these conversations when I was doing my Curious Incident, and I don't know if we actually succeeded because we never opened, but from a cast perspective, it led to some amazing conversations that led us to talk about the show and also ourselves and our identities and the world of theater in a much more nuanced way than when we walked into the first read-through. And that awareness and that attention from a cast going into a show very much bleeds out into how the audience perceives it. So then it also becomes a question of how can we change how we individually look at the piece before we get into the room in the first place. But also, what if we just chose a different play at this point? But I'm gonna leave this one here. I'll give you some time to ponder. There's a lot to ponder in this one. I went full literary analysis to a degree I haven't in a couple videos. But in the meantime, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.